Well, good evening. This is our Greencastle Presbyterian Church study of the Psalms. This is our Lenten online study series, so we welcome you and invite you here. We're going to spend time in the Psalms. It's one of the studies I'm doing with one of our folks, and it's a very rich study. And we're going to begin with the Psalms of Ascent. These are Psalms 120 through 134. Now, a little background about the Psalms. There's many different types of Psalms, and they all have a purpose. These are the songs that Israel used, and particularly the Psalms of Ascent are ones that people who were going on pilgrimages in one of the 3 yearly festivals to go to the temple in Jerusalem, that they would go in groups of people, which they did for safety, and they would be singing as they went. And they would still, as a group, be outside the temple singing and gathering with literally thousands of other people from all over the Jewish diaspora, particularly in the time of Jesus, when they would go to what was then known as Herod's temple. There was 3 temples that we're aware of. Solomon's temple, which David wanted, but Solomon was able to build. And that would be around 950 BCE. And then that was destroyed by the Babylonians around 586. Under Ezra and Nehemiah, they rebuilt the temple of Jerusalem. It was a shadow of the earlier one by Solomon. That was around 450 BCE. And then, of course, in the time of Herod the Great, he had a vast building program and greatly expanded the area and the temple itself. And it was one of the gleaming white wonders of the world at the time. That was a temple that Jesus was very familiar with. And it was a temple that he went to on the pilgrimages with his family. In Luke chapter 2, he is in the temple. He's 12 years old. And of course, his parents lose track of him. They're on their way back in their large group to Nazareth, and where's Jesus? And they had to turn around and lost a day and found him. He was sitting with the rabbis and learned teachers, debating. And what was he doing? Actually, he was studying for his bar mitzvah. He was 12. What would he do at 13? He would join in with many others, and he would have his bar mitzvah ceremony, which still goes on today for young Jewish men and women who are 13, bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah. And that was a part of what he did and part of his trek to the temple. So the Psalms of Ascent, that's because Jerusalem is about 3,000 feet above sea level. And whether you're coming from the north going south, you're still going up. Or if you're coming from the south, you're still going up. And it sits in the middle of about 7 hills. The temple is built on one of those. The platform is there. You can see on the western wall some of the original stones, and I have seen them. They're really large. The engineering of those is marvelous. Of course, the Muslim mosque, the Dome of the Rock, sits where the temple would have sat up until the Roman times. So as they went in these large groups from their villages, for protection, of course, they would be singing. Well, have you ever done a hymn sing in church? And when you're singing, you realize that there's this wonderful sense of unity. Or maybe you've taken a bus trip and you've gone to Sight and Sound or something like that down in Lancaster, and you do the same thing and you find yourself singing. Well, that's what they did. Now, the Psalms of Ascent are just one small part of the book of Psalms, which can compose 150 Psalms. Some are written by David, some by David and Solomon's choir director Asaph, and others by people we don't know. But these were the songs, the hymn books. In the old Presbyterian system, the Psalter was the hymn book, and if it was not scripture, it was not sung. That was a part of what went on back then. It's also one of the most beloved portions of the Bible. And one reason is the Psalms are just so full of emotion. You can cry, you can rejoice, you can laugh, you can lament, you can beat your breast in pain. And the emotional affirmation in the Psalms is one of the reasons the Psalms are so often quoted and so well loved. Jesus quoted the Psalms numerous times in the Gospels. So we're going to walk through the Psalms over the next 6 weeks of the Lenten season. I'll try to put up 6 each week. And I would advise you to have a plan. Now, in your plan, the first thing you would do is probably not jump to conclusions and find a quick, easy solution or say, I'm going to dismiss it. I don't understand it. It doesn't relate to me. Read through the psalm, read 2 or 3 versions. You can go to BibleGateway.com, find all kinds of English versions, find all kinds of versions. BibleGateway.com is a great resource. So allow yourself to be drawn emotionally into the psalm, the way you would not be drawn so much into prose, but into the heightened language of poetry. And read the psalm slowly, and then maybe write down some things, the rich imagery that's there, or things you don't always understand. You'll come across a word, Selah. Selah is a musical pause, like when you're reading music and there's a little transition and the music goes on. Well, it's a musical pause. The words don't need to be said, but you let the music go on, and then, of course, you pick up the verse or the refrain. And then you want to spend time with the images that the writer conveys, because that's where you're going to find great meaning. And, of course, the Psalms were written not only for communal use, but for personal use and private worship. And these songs intimately were used to honestly express their love for God, their petition to ask God to work on their behalf or act or to teach. In the 103rd Psalm, it's a really great line. And it talks about the difference between Moses and the people of Israel. It says, Moses knew God's ways. The people just saw his acts. And that's really quite expressive. And so you might even want to sing the Psalms. Psalm 5 is often sung. Psalm 84 is one of those beautiful Psalms. I heard an elderly man from Guyana who got up and sang Psalm 84 in a kind of a high old voice, and it was just a thing of beauty. So these are very ancient, and yet they have a lot of play even in contemporary life, and people use the Psalms a lot. And then you might just remember who's been reading this book for these many years. The Psalms are written in ancient Israel for Israel. So each psalm has a context, and you have to understand the historical shell around that. Sometimes it's pretty easy. Sometimes it's impossible to do without a little bit of help, but different translations help. Study Bibles help. You can go online and find all kinds of resources these days. And you can use them to shape and inform your sense of private and your public worship. So I'm going to read Psalm 120, and I'll give you the context. For the Jewish person at those times, life was hard. They lived with a lot of trouble. They were an odd people, familiar with persecution, in a tiny land that was often occupied by foreign armies. They had waterfront, and the armies wanted to get to the Mediterranean. They also lived in a time when the conveniences we take for granted, food, healthcare, security, these are very tenuous. And they lived in a time when they were occupied, at least in the times of Jesus, and certainly 170 years before that, in the times of the Maccabees, and on and on. So you might have to ask, as they're making their journey to Jerusalem in these Psalms of Ascent, what were their lives like? What were their hopes? What were their dreams? And I think you might find them to be much like your own. So make a few notes where the Psalms meet you today, and what would you like to say to God? What are your hopes and dreams? So I'll read, and this is a New International Version. I'll read Psalm 120. I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. Save me, O God, from lying lips and deceitful tongues. What will he do to you, and what more beside, O deceitful tongue? He will punish you with a warrior's sharp arrows, with burning coals of the broom tree. Woe to me that I dwell in Meshach and live among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I lived among those who hate peace. I am a person of peace, but when I speak, they are for war. Just a couple of cues into that particular psalm, okay? So these are psalms that, of course, people are singing, right? And they are the people of God going to the temple of God in Jerusalem, and this is about their own integrity, but they also live in a world that is difficult for them. Meshach and Kedar are tents of, it says wickedness, well, not wickedness, but these are tents where people live in such a strange way that is different from them. They're not people of faith. They're not people of integrity. They're not people who will live by the values that the Psalms dispose. And they want peace, but they find that when they want peace, others want war. Well, certainly this week, that's very contemporary. So take a look at these Psalms, begin to read Psalm 120, take your time with it, do a little research on it, and I think that you will have a very rich Lenten experience. God bless you, and we'll see you tomorrow.